Something has apparently changed behind the stone walls of Balmoral, and if the reports surrounding it are accurate, it is not simply another disagreement over rooms, schedules, or family protocol. It concerns access, more specifically, access to a secure part of the estate allegedly containing material connected to the private history of the royal family. And the name at the center of the story is not King Charles, it is William. The claim is an extraordinary one, that William has revoked Camilla's access to what has been described as the Balmoral estate vault, leaving the Queen deeply upset by the decision. But there is a detail that must be established before going any further, because without it, the entire story becomes misleading. There has been no public announcement from Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, or the Balmoral estate confirming that Prince William personally issued such an order. There is also no official publicly available inventory identifying a room formerly called the Balmoral Estate Vault. And there has been no verified palace statement confirming that Camilla was reduced to tears over an access decision. Those points matter, because what can be established is, in many ways, more interesting. Balmoral is not simply another royal palace. Buckingham Palace is occupied by the monarch in an official capacity. Windsor Castle is an occupied royal palace held as part of the institutional monarchy. Balmoral is different. It is private property. King Charles III personally owns the Balmoral estate. The royal family's own financial information explicitly states that Charles owns both Balmoral and Sandringham, having inherited the two private estates from Queen Elizabeth II after her death on September 8, 2022. That distinction changes everything. Balmoral did not come to Charles because he became king in precisely the same manner that the Crown Estate or the official royal residences came under his use as sovereign. Balmoral descended as private royal property. Its history goes back to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Victoria and Albert first leased Balmoral in 1848. They were sufficiently taken with Deeside that the property was purchased outright in 1852. The existing house was eventually replaced with the granite castle that became one of the most recognizable private royal residences in Britain. It was deliberately conceived as a family home, and that character survived. George V used it. George VI used it. Elizabeth II spent substantial portions of her summer there. It was at Balmoral, on September 6, 2022, that Elizabeth appointed Liz Truss as Prime Minister. 2 days later, the Queen died at the castle at the age of 96. Charles inherited a property saturated with private memory, and as of this very month, it remains central to his life. The official court circular records that King Charles arrived at Balmoral Castle on the morning of August 18, 2026. He was received by the Lord Lieutenant of Aberdeenshire, Alexander Manson, before inspecting the Royal Guard provided by Balaclava Company, 5th Battalion, the Royal Regiment of Scotland. 5 days later, on Sunday, August 23rd, divine service was held at nearby Crathie Parish Church. So we are not discussing an abandoned family archive or an estate existing only as a historical backdrop. Balmoral is active, it is private, and the king is there now, which raises the central difficulty with the claim involving William. William may be Prince of Wales, he may be the heir apparent, he may be the man expected one day to inherit responsibilities that currently belong to his father, but William does not presently own Balmoral. Charles does. William became the 25th Duke of Cornwall following his father's accession in September 2022, giving him responsibility for the Duchy of Cornwall and its income. Yet, the Duchy of Cornwall and the Balmoral estate are two completely separate bodies of property. There is no constitutional mechanism by which being Prince of Wales automatically gives William unilateral ownership authority over his father's private Balmoral estate. So if Camilla's access to a secure area at Balmoral really has been altered, one question immediately becomes unavoidable: who actually authorized it? Because an instruction affecting the king's privately owned residence would ordinarily have to derive from the king himself, from the estate administration acting under his authority, or from someone to whom the relevant authority had specifically been delegated. And if William has become involved in decisions at that level, that would be considerably more significant than a story about a locked door. It would tell us something about how responsibilities inside the House of Windsor are being divided while Charles is still king. And that is where Balmoral's locked rooms become far more interesting than they initially appear. There is another reason the idea of restricted access at Balmoral carries such weight. Charles and Camilla's connection to the estate is not recent. Long before Charles became king and Camilla became queen, Birkhall served as one of their most private retreats. Birkhall sits on the Balmoral estate and had previously been used by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. After her death in 2002, Charles continued using the residence. Official royal family material described Charles and Camilla as spending private time there while carrying out duties in Scotland. That means Camilla has been associated with the Balmoral landscape for well over 2 decades. She married Charles at Windsor Guildhall on April 9, 2005. When Queen Elizabeth II died in September 2022, Charles became king and Camilla became queen consort. At Westminster Abbey on May 6, 2023, she was crowned alongside Charles. Official usage subsequently settled on the simpler title, the Queen. So the notion that Camilla might suddenly find herself denied access to a sensitive section of her husband's private Scottish estate carries an obvious emotional charge. But access is not the same thing as ownership, and ownership is not the same thing as constitutional status. That distinction becomes particularly important when William enters the picture. Since 2022, William has simultaneously been Prince of Wales and Duke of Cornwall. The Duchy of Cornwall was created by Edward III in 1337 specifically to provide income to the heir to the throne. Its modern estate contains agricultural, residential, and commercial property, and William receives its annual net surplus. But William cannot simply sell the duchy and pocket the capital. He effectively acts as its steward for future Dukes of Cornwall. Balmoral operates on an entirely different basis. It belongs privately to Charles. That makes any purported intervention by William much more delicate. Imagine for a moment that an internal security review did change who could enter a particular archive, collection room, or secure storage area at Balmoral. That change could be real without representing a declaration of war against Camilla. Historic material is frequently subject to controlled access. Valuable objects may be restricted because of conservation requirements. Private correspondence may be handled under archival rules. Jewelry, documents, photographs, and personal papers may be governed by entirely different systems depending upon who legally owns them. There could also be insurance requirements, security reviews, or changes to the number of people carrying keys or electronic permissions. And we know that Balmoral does contain historically significant material. The Royal Archives has records relating to Balmoral and Sandringham dating from the 19th century onwards. Royal Collection Trust documentation also confirms that extensive collections of books and other material have historically been maintained at Balmoral Castle, while the principal Royal Library and Royal Archives are situated at Windsor Castle. That is an important correction to the more dramatic versions of the story. There is no evidence that Britain's central royal archives are hidden underground at Balmoral. They are not. The principal archive is at Windsor, but Balmoral has generated and retained private material for more than 170 years. Think about what that period covers. Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, Edward VII, George V, George VI, Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip. 7 decades of Elizabeth's reign alone produced an extraordinary quantity of private family history. The Royal Archives confirms that records concerning the management of Balmoral itself stretch back to the 19th century. So when people hear the word vault, they naturally imagine jewels, wills, sealed letters, and boxes containing explosive family secrets. That is precisely where caution is required. A secure room is not necessarily a treasure vault. An archive is not necessarily a collection of scandalous correspondence. And no responsible account can claim that William has discovered letters, wills, or jewelry there without evidence identifying those objects. Yet the issue of access remains powerful for another reason. Inside a royal household, permission can be symbolic. A person does not need to lose a title to understand that their position has changed. They do not need to be removed from a residence. They do not need to be excluded from Christmas. Sometimes the signal is smaller. A briefing is no longer sent. A private meeting is held without them. A document is redirected, a key is returned, a name disappears from an access list. That is why, if there has been a genuine change concerning Camilla at Balmoral, the paperwork matters more than the emotion attributed to her afterwards. Who controls the room? Who owns the contents? Who ordered the restriction? When did it take effect? And does the restriction apply only to Camilla, or to everyone who does not have an operational reason to enter? Without answers to those questions, saying simply that William locked Camilla out tells us almost nothing. But there is one scenario that would transform the meaning of the story. If Charles himself approved a transfer of practical responsibility to William, particularly over sensitive private family material, then the real story would not be William acting against the Queen. It would be the king quietly giving his heir responsibilities that William did not previously exercise. This is where royal property becomes extraordinarily complicated, because the public tends to place every castle, painting, jewel, and document into one imaginary box marked the royal family. Legally, they are not all in the same box. Some assets are held by the sovereign in right of the crown. Some are administered by the crown estate. Some form part of the royal collection. Some belong to institutions. Others are privately owned. Balmoral belongs in that final category. The distinction dates back to its acquisition by Victoria and Albert. When they began staying there in 1848, they leased the estate. 4 years later, in 1852, the property was purchased. Prince Albert became heavily involved in designing the new castle, which replaced the older residence. That private ownership survived generations of monarchs, and because Balmoral remained private, it could serve a purpose very different from Buckingham Palace. At Balmoral, monarchs could be family members as well as heads of state. Elizabeth II famously treated the annual Scottish stay as a period in which the machinery surrounding monarchy became somewhat less formal. Photographs from different decades show the family outdoors, attending the Braemar gathering, walking, riding, and spending time around the estate. Prince Philip also took a serious interest in Balmoral's working operation. The royal family has documented his involvement in estate management, livestock, and environmental projects. One project specifically mentioned by the palace was a 2-megawatt hydroelectric scheme built on the estate. These details matter because Balmoral is not merely a castle containing royal bedrooms. It is a functioning estate. It has employees, land management, buildings, collections, private residences, historic records, security infrastructure, and administrative systems which continue whether or not cameras are present. So what might restricting access actually look like? Probably nothing like the dramatic image suggested by the word revokes. There may be no confrontation in a corridor, no guard physically blocking the Queen, no key snatched from her hand. In a modern, secure environment, access can be changed administratively. A person's authorization may simply be removed from a list. A staff instruction may redefine who is permitted to enter. A curator may require supervised access. A private secretary may determine that certain documents are released only through a particular office. That is why the identity of the decision-maker is so crucial. William has enormous institutional importance, but his status as heir does not erase Charles's present authority. Charles is the sovereign. Charles owns Balmoral, and Camilla is Charles's queen. Those three facts have to coexist with any claim that William has somehow intervened. It is possible for William to exercise delegated responsibility. It is possible for estate officials to carry out security decisions. It is possible for collections to be reorganized. But those possibilities cannot be converted into factual claims about a specific dispute without evidence. Then there is the phrase, attracting perhaps the greatest attention of all, left in tears. At present, there is no verified palace statement, photograph, court circular entry, or reliable on-record account demonstrating that Camilla broke down in tears because William removed her access to a Balmoral storage area. That does not prove that no private disagreement occurred. Royal households do not publish minutes of family arguments, but absence of public evidence means the emotional scene cannot responsibly be narrated as though a camera had been standing in the room. And this particular family understands better than most how quickly interpretation becomes accepted as fact. William was 15 years old when Diana died in Paris on August 31st, 1997. Harry was 12. Camilla's relationship with Charles had already become inseparable in the public imagination from the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage. Decades later, Camilla became queen. William became heir apparent. Those two facts ensure that almost any story involving William imposing a boundary on Camilla immediately acquires a second meaning in the eyes of the public. People do not see only an administrative decision. They see Diana. They see the 1990s. They see Charles's remarriage. They see the future king confronting the woman who eventually occupied the position once held by his mother. That historical baggage is precisely why evidence is essential, because an ordinary security change can be transformed within hours into a story of revenge, and a private family arrangement can be presented as a constitutional power struggle. There is, however, a legitimate succession question beneath all of this. William is preparing for a role he has never held before. Every heir does. The institution cannot wait until the exact second a monarch dies to begin transferring knowledge. Briefings happen in advance. Relationships with officials are developed. Estate structures are learned. Private and public responsibilities have to be understood. William's position as Duke of Cornwall already gives him direct experience managing a substantial landed estate, distinct from the monarchy's publicly funded activities. That does not make him owner of Balmoral, but it does mean that estate stewardship is not an unfamiliar concept to him. And if Charles is increasing William's exposure to Balmoral's private administration, that would fit a far broader process of preparing an heir. The important word there is if, because preparation is demonstrable as a constitutional necessity. A secret personal campaign against Camilla is not. Part 4. There is one final element to the Balmoral story which explains why even a small alteration in access would resonate far beyond Scotland. Balmoral is where the monarchy remembers itself. Queen Victoria wrote about it. Prince Albert shaped it. George VI used it. Elizabeth II loved it. Prince Philip worked on its estate affairs. Charles spent part of his adult private life at Birkhall, and Elizabeth died there. That creates a peculiar kind of authority around the place. Buckingham Palace represents the office. Westminster Abbey represents coronation. Windsor carries almost 1,000 years of royal history. But Balmoral feels personal. So who is allowed into its most private spaces can easily be interpreted as a judgment about who belongs inside the family's inner history. That is why the present allegation has traveled so effectively. William Revokes Camilla's access contains everything required to turn administration into drama. The future king, his stepmother, his late mother's memory, a Scottish castle, a locked room, and something supposedly concealed inside it. But strip away the assumptions, and several facts remain. First, King Charles owns Balmoral privately. Second, William does not automatically acquire authority over that property simply because he is Prince of Wales. Third, William's Duchy of Cornwall is a separate estate. Fourth, genuine historical collections and Balmoral estate records do exist, although the principal royal archives are at Windsor Castle. Fifth, there is no public palace confirmation establishing that William personally revoked Camilla's access to a location officially called the Balmoral Estate Vault. And sixth, there is no reliable public evidence confirming that Camilla was left crying because of such an order. Those facts do not make the underlying subject insignificant. They tell us what to watch. If responsibility over Charles's private estates begins moving toward William, evidence will eventually appear not through dramatic anonymous quotations, but through patterns. Who attends estate meetings? Who receives briefings? Who represents the king? Which office issues instructions? Which responsibilities become associated with Kensington Palace rather than the king's household? And, crucially, whether Charles himself publicly or privately formalizes any new role for his eldest son. We already know that practical responsibilities inside this family can move before titles do. Prince Philip managed and took a profound interest in the Queen's private estates for decades, even though Elizabeth remained their owner. The palace itself records Philip's involvement with Balmoral and Sandringham. That is an instructive precedent. A royal family member can carry substantial management responsibility without owning the estate. So it would not be constitutionally extraordinary for Charles to ask William to assume responsibilities concerning Balmoral. What would be extraordinary is William doing so against Charles's wishes. That is the distinction missing from the most sensational version of this story. If Charles authorized William to review security surrounding private collections, then William would not be seizing control from Camilla. He would be carrying out responsibility delegated by the king. If estate officials independently tightened access for conservation or security reasons, the story becomes more administrative still. If Camilla retains precisely the same access she had before, then the entire controversy collapses. Those are radically different possibilities. And until documentary or on-record evidence emerges, they cannot responsibly be treated as though only the most dramatic version has been proved. There is another point worth remembering. Camilla's position does not depend upon possession of a Balmoral key. She is queen because she is married to the reigning sovereign and was crowned alongside him. William's position does not depend upon removing that key. He is heir apparent because he is the king's eldest son and Prince of Wales. Their constitutional positions are not competing claims to the same office. The tension, where it exists, is about something more human: legacy, memory, influence, and proximity to Charles. That is why the smallest private decision can acquire enormous symbolic meaning. One locked cabinet at Balmoral would not alter the line of succession. One restricted archive would not remove a queen. One new responsibility would not make William king before his time. But symbols matter enormously inside monarchy because monarchy itself depends so heavily upon them. A crown is a symbol. A title is a symbol. A procession is a symbol. A seat beside the sovereign can be a symbol. And yes, access to a room containing generations of private royal history could become one as well. So the question should not simply be whether Camilla has been locked out. The question is whether anything has changed in the distribution of private authority around King Charles. That is the development worth watching. Because Charles is 77 years old, William is 44. The Prince of Wales is no longer the young Duke of Cambridge, waiting somewhere in the background. He is the first person in the line of succession, the 25th Duke of Cornwall, and the man who will inherit the constitutional burden of the crown when his father's reign ends. Every additional responsibility he assumes therefore carries meaning, but meaning is not proof. And until Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, the Balmoral estate, and identified official or documentary evidence establishes that an access order actually exists, the claim that William revoked Camilla's access and that she was left in tears remains an allegation rather than an established event. The genuine story is subtler. A privately owned Scottish estate inherited by Charles from Elizabeth II is entering another period in its long history. The king remains its owner. The queen remains at his side. The heir is becoming increasingly important. And somewhere between those three positions lies the question that will eventually matter far more than any supposed key to a vault. How much of Charles's private world is William already being prepared to manage?